as well as it has been on the Labour front benches. Well, I think it's fair to say that, like, when we listen to Labour talking about a Green New Deal or Green New Industrial Revolution, whatever the phrase was, last year, there was a lot of emphasis on electricity generation, on heating and so on. There was a bit, and on green cars, but there was a bit less from memory on aviation. Do you think that's fair?
So, I mean, I think it's important to remember, as John said in his opening comments, that aviation contribution in terms of global emissions is 3%. So there's a whole 97% of global carbon emissions to focus on. It's a big, big job, and government has to have its eye on reducing our impact on global emissions in every context that we're doing so. And I think it's important to always look at this in a much bigger context than just aviation. And I think, as Andy said, there's so much we could do with the right economic framework, the right incentives, the right investment to bring down the carbon emissions within aviation. But also, we shouldn't be doing that at the expense of not focusing on where we can reduce emissions in every other aspect of our lives. And we know that many emissions come from households, come from factories, come from the way we produce things. There is a whole range of things that government should be absolutely focused on, and not just because it's the right thing to do, which it is, not just because we know that there is a global emergency in terms of global warming and carbon emissions, but because it does make economic sense too. If we make the right investments and we truly invest in creating that carbon ideally neutral society of the future, but it's not going to happen by itself, and we need those incentives and investments there. So whilst obviously I'm very focused on aviation, it's a big part of the economy in the Northeast, and it's a big part of my role as an MP for Newcastle North. There are so many other aspects that we need to be focused on, and I think we have a big job to do, but there is also so much potential there to create jobs, and that's a big deal for the Northeast. We know that coming out of Brexit, coming out of this pandemic, regions like the Northeast are going to face some of the greatest hurdles. So I will always make the case for investment in the future, investment in our trade, investment in our production capabilities, but also investment in making those as sustainable for the future, because the jobs come from creating the sustainability as much as from ploughing on, in a carbon irresponsible way. I think we will generate those jobs of the future by creating those new opportunities and new technologies, that the jobs themselves will come from too.
So obviously, Catherine, I agree. I think anyone would agree that lots and lots of the climate discussion has to be a mile away from aviation, because there's so many other bits that are important. I mean, what I was really getting at, though, is whether there might be something of a culture clash here, which means that people who are very interested in Green New Deals, the environment and so on, don't tend to think, they tend to think of aviation only in terms of reducing the number of flights, rather than some of these ideas like, big bold things like moving to hydrogen based flying. Do you think there's work to do there in terms of getting campaigners positively interested in these things?
Yes, I do. I would agree. I think there are a lot of people, a lot of the pushback that comes from there's a big balance to strike between arguing for, as I always will, for, redistributing our economic activity around the country, not centralising it all on the southeast, making sure we have those jobs and opportunities in the region, and then being able to do that in a sustainable way. And I know the fundamental importance of our regional aviation capacity to do that. But a lot of people would argue, well, get on a train, travel to the south and fly from there. And there are a whole load of issues with that, in that quite often we are simply exporting our carbon. So, rather than dealing with the actual carbon itself. We're just shifting it so that we don't feel like we're creating it in the northeast, we're creating it in the south instead. So I think we do need a really realistic discussion about not just shifting carbon around, but actually genuinely committing to reducing it. And I think some of the arguments that go against investing in our regional aviation capacity, which I believe we should be, and that's why I'm fully behind everything that we can do to clean up aviation and make aviation play its part in reducing carbon, but also looking at more holistically and making sure that as a country we're doing everything we can to reduce our carbon. And if aviation is it is a net at the moment and not a net contributor to that effort, then we need to both focus on reducing the carbon emissions from aviation, but also look at everything else we can do to reduce our carbon emissions, because aviation and connectivity is part of the future. And I know we had a bit of debate around, will people really need to travel so much? Will we not do an awful lot online? I think without a doubt, we are going to see change in the future in terms of how business is done, how often we need to travel in order to conduct business. But I think ultimately underneath every one of those planes that goes is a belly load of cargo. And that's really what people don't see and often don't think of. They think of the human passengers sitting in the seats. They don't think about all the goods that we transport around. And I think as proud exporters and producers, we need to think of the most carbon neutral ways to distribute those goods and how to offset it where you cannot entirely minimise and eradicate the carbon that's produced from it.
Terrific, thank you. We've got 3 great questions here lined up, which I'm going to get to in a moment. I should just say, for anyone who's our audience there, we've shared a couple of things. The roadmap is now pinged around, so the audience can look at that if they want, from sustainable aviation. But here's one that might be a bit more controversial. If the government wants something to happen, there's a couple of different ways it can go about it. It could give subsidised loans or grants and proactive industrial policy, or it could take perhaps the tougher route and say, right, we're going to tax the bad behaviour to force the good behaviour. Now, John, when I was doing an event with your sustainability director, I think last year, to my surprise, as a Heathrow man, he was saying, yeah, we might need to, there's some details about how you should rewire the air passenger duty. But he was saying, nonetheless, that he thought the amount of tax on a flight might ultimately need to go up. And he was confident that Heathrow would be able to deal with that, which I was very surprised by and kind of impressed, I guess. Now, obviously, the airline industry is in a more, absolutely unavoidably, in a more defensive place this year. But just any thoughts any of you have, John, first, on whether tax here might need to play a tough role in this mix?
Well, I think, I mean, at the moment, the UK aviation sector has air passenger duty, which is where the further you fly, the more you pay. And if you're at the front of the plane in business or first class, you pay a lot more than if you're in economy. And it raises about £4 billion a year, or did last year, for the government. So it's a very significant tax. It does nothing for climate change. It is purely a form of taxation. And this goes back to Catherine's point earlier. There are lots of well-intentioned initiatives that are brought in of stopping expanding airports, taxing flights, that don't really do anything to tackle the real source. And that's what we tried to do here. Now, the government hates to have any kind of hypothecation where you say, I'm going to take this revenue and put it against this particular use. But I think we can be more progressive with the way that passenger duty is used. And if you were to say to a company like British Airways, well, if to encourage you to move faster towards decarbonisation, given that the problem is an economic one, if we were to charge you less air passenger duty on flights which were using sustainable fuels, then that would give them a real economic incentive to shift. And given that air passenger duty at the moment with nobody flying is pretty much close to zero, now is the time to put those kinds of changes in place. And it's those kinds of economic levers that can really make a difference in bridging the gap that Andy was talking about between cheap kerosene and currently more expensive sustainable aviation fuels. If I just pick up on another point that Catherine made, I think she makes a fantastic point about a new sunrise industry in the UK regions. And if we think about the synthetic fuels we were talking about, we need hydrogen and carbon, and we need a massive source of low-cost energy to create the hydrogen. Well, in many parts of the UK regions, we have that with wind and solar, and we're expanding that. We have fantastic chemical engineering skills in this country and skilled engineering in places like the Northeast. Well, that's where we should be moving towards creating synthetic fuels, using this low-cost source of energy. And this will be something that we can export around the world. And the unique ability we have in the UK is that we have all parts of the aviation value chain right here. We have BP and Shell, who are two of the world leaders and the most progressive around decarbonisation. And so we can harness the skills we have now to migrate to an entirely new industrial sector. So we're not losing jobs there as petrochemical industries decarbonise. But we also help to protect jobs at places like Rolls-Royce. That if we have drop-in fuels that use Rolls-Royce's engines, that protects employment for them and their supply chain. So there's a real opportunity to both protect jobs in the UK supply chain, but also create entirely new jobs in new sectors such as sustainable fuels.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Would either of the other two of you like to jump in on the question of tax? If so, please do. If not, I've got questions from the audience I'm going to turn to now.
I'll quickly jump in, Tom. So I suppose from Sustainable Aviation's point of view, we've assumed actually a carbon price is applied to aviation going forwards in that roadmap. And we assume that the price for that goes up from relatively low levels to about £220 per tonne of carbon by 2050. Now, realistically, that's going to be paid for by the airlines through what they're having to pay to kind of offset and do carbon removal. And I think it's reasonable to anticipate that price would then be passed on to the consumer somehow. So I think within that, what we've shown is that affects, if you like, the unrestricted demand for aviation in this country. So at the top of our roadmap, we've got a sort of a pale blue wedge, which is attempting to demonstrate that. I think a couple of important points from that. One is, even with that price applied, there's still a demand to travel and to grow aviation here in the UK. So carbon pricing alone wouldn't stop flying. I think the other one is, how do we as a country do this in a fair and equitable way? So if we apply a carbon tax, we can apply it quite easily to the UK-based companies, so British Airways, EasyJet, et cetera, et cetera. But how do you deal with other airlines who then may choose not to fly into the UK and to avoid the tax effectively and fly to a European hub? And I think those are the sort of things where we've got to be careful we don't end up just exporting our carbon somewhere else. But realistically, we're anticipating there will be a carbon price, and that will be paid in some way by consumers here in the UK.
Okay, we've got, let's give the people who are sending in now some quite excellent questions a chance to weigh in. There's a couple here that relate to Catherine specifically. One is wide open from Jonathan Council, which is question for you, Catherine, which is, John and Andy have outlined what the aviation sector is doing or might do to deliver net zero emissions by 2050. But then what else do you think we should be doing? I'm not sure if what he has in mind there is, what else should government be doing to make them do even more, or what do we need to do across the wider economy? I think let's go for what should public policy be doing, because we've already talked about the fact that it's a broader problem.
Gosh, well, I mean, where to start with that? I mean, there's so much we should be doing in terms of generally decarbonising our every aspect of our lives, and one of the things I do genuinely worry about is that you know, we're in the middle of almost three crises all at the same time. We are in a pandemic, and there's no two ways around that. And it is causing not only a health crisis that we're all facing, but it's causing an economic crisis too. We are in the middle of a Brexit crisis. I would describe it that way, because I think there is not sufficient certainty about the future, and so the consequences of how we come through these next 6 months have potential ramifications for our economy too. So once again, it feeds into an economic crisis. And then we're in a climate crisis. And I think we can't, and before Brexit came along and before the pandemic came along, the climate crisis was our number one priority. And I think the big risk is that when we're facing three crises simultaneously, that I think the sustainability crisis is the one that will fall down the priority list. So I think we need to do everything we can to have that capacity to look at them in the whole, and to try and come out without prioritizing one or the other, because I think coming out of all three crises, not just surviving, but actually creating the green shoots of a better planet, and a better society and a better country. So it's a huge challenge, but I think it's one that we cannot take our eye off at all. And just going back to the tax issue, I think the tax is hugely important. And I think how we tax carbon is absolutely key. And I think there's the taxing of carbon, and there's also the government investment in decarbonisation. And I think the two have to, you have to use one and you have to use both. You can't just tax everything and hope it sorts itself out. I think if you're genuinely going to create a level playing field where genuine, market forces can bring us through these crises, I think you have to tax the things that are causing the harm. You have to invest in the things that are going to create the solutions of the future. And so I think we need both. And I think we need it not just, I've often been frustrated with the way our taxation system works, because I don't think it yet does enough to create that level playing field, not just internationally, but nationally as well. And I know I sound like a bit of a broken record, but I think we run the risk of coming out of this with perhaps the strengths in our economy, which are often southeast focused, investing in, and then overall we've come out of this, we've survived, we're growing again, but actually some parts of the country are left behind. And we've seen that in after crisis that this country has faced. The areas like the northeast don't get the investment that they need. And I think let's learn from that. Let's invest, because we can be part of the solution and part of growing us out into a more sustainable future.
Okay, thank you for that. We've got questions here bubbling in. One here about the fairness aspect, something you'd always expect to be pushed at a Labour conference. There's a quote from an Oxfam report from Jane Ayres here saying that the wealthiest 1% of the world's population were responsible for the emissions of more than twice as much as the poorer half since 1990, since we really knew what was going on, in other words, with climate change. So there's this enormous discrepancy. So I'm not obsessing about the tax question, but one way that some people have talked about tackling this, and I don't mind if Andy or John wants to pick this one up, is by having a sort of frequent flyer levy, so that, if you needed one family reunion, one holiday visit a year or something, you'd be fine. But if you're hopping on a plane every weekend, you're a bigger part of the problem, and maybe the air passenger duty should be higher for you. Andy, let's go to you first. Do you think that's in any way plausible?
I think this is an interesting debate, and it's one that I think will evolve. Certainly, as I say, from sustainable aviation, we've assumed that there will be some element of carbon pricing applied to aviation going forwards, and that will result in some shape or form into what people pay when they're flying. I think, just to echo, I think the points that both Catherine and John have alluded to is that, if we're going to put a price on carbon and put that onto people, we need to have some certainty that that's having a valued and direct benefit back in terms of taking carbon out of aviation. I think that's the concern that you probably have from the industry's perspective is, we recognise carbon's a problem. That's why we've done the roadmap and we're committed to net zero emissions by 2050. We would like to do as much as possible of that through in-sector actions, but what we can't do then, we accept that there's an element of carbon pricing that would have to be applied. So I think it's about how you would do that in a fair way that doesn't end up penalising UK companies versus non-UK companies.
Okay. John, whilst you mull your answer to that, you can bundle that in with a thought here we've got from David, which is, if the idea is to reduce carbon emissions per flight, on the one hand, which sounds great, but on the other, that we're also, for all the reasons you talk about, with jobs and growth, returning the industry to an upward trajectory rather than this year's downward one, how do we make sure that overall the industry is responsible for fewer emissions rather than more, as those two effects potentially pull in opposite directions?
Well, I mean, the starting point is we are aiming to decarbonise the entire sector. So in 30 years' time, we shouldn't be talking about carbon from flight because we'll have decarbonised the entire sector. And secondly, this is not just about the UK. This is a global industry. Things we do just here in this country might make us feel better, but do nothing at all to tackle the real issues. And that's why we have to work on a global scale. And that's why the kind of things that are being led out of the UK and the kind of commitment that's been made by BP and British Airways to decarbonise, and by ourselves, that is so significant because that sets a template for how you can actually decarbonise aviation and take the problem away altogether globally. And this also goes to the point of fairness, that if you go to somewhere like India or many parts of Africa, they have a very small aviation sector today. But in order to take people out of poverty, they rely on aviation to stimulate their economy. And they see it as being a deep question of unfairness if we tell them they should fly less or tax people for flying. What we're giving them is an alternative to that, which actually many Indian companies and the government are getting on board with. And in fact, there are some Indian airlines who are committed to net zero by 2050 because they can see that sustainable aviation fuel will allow them to keep growing their economy and keep growing their aviation sector while decarbonising at the same time. That's hugely important. And we shouldn't get too focused on these sort of short-term issues that make us feel better, but as Catherine says, just export the issue.
Okay.
Can I just pick up another thing that Catherine mentioned, and which was picked up in one of the other questions, which is there a risk that this slows down because of the pandemic? And I'm sure we all worry about that somewhat. Actually, what I'm seeing is that things are speeding up, if anything. We're seeing, I'm probably having more meetings on decarbonisation now than I was having back in February, and at a global level. And the UK genuinely is taking a lead on this. And the milestones for this are, first of all, to make sure this is part of the government agenda for COP26, and that we have some real solutions to decarbonising aviation that we can showcase next year. And then the next stepping stone is the ICAO General Assembly in September 2022, where we're looking for a global agreement on net zero by 2050, signed up to by China and India and the United States and Brazil. Now, that would be an enormous, a huge achievement, the equivalent of the Paris Accord in itself. And a year ago, I wouldn't have thought that was possible. Now I think we genuinely have a chance to do that. And the pandemic has accelerated that because it's made people realize just how valuable aviation is and how much we have to lose if we don't tackle a real issue in climate change from which there is no coming back.
I imagine, just to move us on to politics, because we are at a party conference, of course, albeit of a new sort, that rather a lot will turn on the outcome of the US election for whether we might get their signature on the line for that. But closer to home on the political front, Catherine, we've got a question here from an attendee about the most important difference they think between the parties at the last election was really about the timing. Can you just remind us what the position is that the government's taken and what Labour's taken on when they want to get to this carbon neutrality?
I mean, I personally, I don't think that the government is prioritising this nearly enough, and we've seen that in some of the decisions that they've taken in terms of, well, even just getting them to listen and discuss and genuinely engage in proactive investment in the future. And I think that's one of the big challenges that we face, that this isn't going to happen by itself. It needs to be a partnership between public and private. We need the policy environment that incentivizes the solutions that we need to create for the future. We need a tax framework that incentivizes and motivates it, and we need the investment as well. And I think that's one of the big differences, is that willingness to genuinely invest in not only the jobs of the future, but the planet of the future as well. And I think Labour is clearly committed to making the kind of large-scale infrastructure and structural investment that's going to be required, but making the economic case that it will make those returns for both people and for planet. And I think there are some big differences between the parties, but we'll keep making the case to this government that that's the investment that they need to make for jobs, for levelling up, which they pay a lot of lip service to, and to the planet as well in the future.
Andy, time's nearly up, but I wondered if you shed any light on this, because I think it was 2030 or 35 versus 2050 became a big dividing line. Listening to lots of the very interesting things you were talking about that should be happening over the decades, there is, as you know, a fear in the Labour tribe particularly that we don't have the time. How do you see the two parties on this question of what needs to happen when?
Impossible question. We obviously try and stay out of politics as best we can. It's just working with those that want to help us decarbonise aviation. But certainly, I think there are opportunities post-COVID. As John was saying, there's an accelerated interest in decarbonising aviation, and a commitment hasn't wavered across the industry. By 2030, a lot of it hinges on where is aviation in terms of its rebound post-COVID, as to what kind of carbon position are we in. Certainly, I see the UK will be at a lower level of carbon emissions in 2030 than we were in 2019, and that trend line will continue down to net zero by 2050.
Okay, thank you very much. We're almost up against it, and it's important because people will have other fringes and so on to go to try and be relatively strict, although there's so much food for thought here, we could keep going for ages. But let's just bring in a question from Madeline Lynch, who says, what actions in the sector are going on now to decarbonise the aviation industry? We've heard about lots. I'd just like to ask each of you to nominate one by way of a closing thought. One thing you want us to keep an eye on to see if we're really making progress here before I then wrap up. So John first.
Well, it's all about sustainable aviation fuel. That's the one way we can get there by 2050. The faster we scale up, the faster we can get there. And that really is the constraint on whether it is 2050 or 2045 or even 2035. How quickly can we scale up sustainable aviation fuels? And if the investment is there, the right environment, then we may be able to do something quicker.
John, thank you very much. That's fantastic. Andy, any single thing you'd like us to keep an eye out for to see if we're really making the progress we hope we can make?
So if John's gone for sustainable fuel, I should say airspace modernisation. I want us to see us flying smarter with less emissions on the routes between A and B. Okay,
fantastic. And Catherine, what would you...
I'm sorry it's not very exciting, but I completely agree that and that we're not going to get there, and we're not going to get there in the time frame that we need without some serious government investment. But I think we just have to keep our eye on the prize, which is not only sustainable aviation, which will continue to enable us to trade, but also the number of jobs. I mean, I'm just looking at the figures here. By 2035, 14 sustainable aviation production facilities could be operational in the UK, employing over 5,000 people and contributing £742 million annually to the economy. Those are the projections, but it does need the right policy environment. It needs the right investment. It needs government to look seriously at reaching that sustainability that we want to see by 2030 rather than 2050. So we need a government that's going to invest in it without delay.
Thank you very much. A nice note of urgency on which to end there. I'm Tom Clark, the editor of Prospect Magazine. It's been a delight to talk to John Holland-Kaye, Andy Jefferson and Catherine McKinnell about this pressing question of how we can clean up the skies while still flying. Thanks to all of you for attending. I can see that some of you in the last 2 minutes have already nipped out to the next fringe, which is always the way at party conferences. But for those of you who are still in the room, as it were, there is a recording. And so if there's anything you want to check back on our discussion, that should be available on the Prospect site in due course, I hope. But thanks very much to all our panelists, to our audience, and also to Heathrow for getting behind the event. And yeah, may the debate continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.